Hey guys, I'm back. We are on the last chapter of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and it's called the Fighter Quarrelers Cure. So it looks like we have two sisters, and they must be fighting an awful lot. Let's see what happens. Joan Russell opened her blue eyes and saw that it was morning. She saw also that her twin sister Anne was still asleep. Joan reached over and gave Anne a little pinch. "Wake up, Anne," she said, making her voice scary and urgent. "Wake up quickly! There's a big black spider in the bed and it's on your side." She's being mean, ain't she? Anne awoke with a squeal, leapt out of bed, stubbed her toe in the box of paints she had left on the floor that night, banged her funny bone on the door, and went screaming into her mother and father's room. "Mother, Daddy, there's a big black spider in our bed on my side. Mother, Daddy." She just woke her parents up. Mrs. Russell sighed, sat up, and reached for her robe. She said in a low, calm voice, "Anne, you didn't fall for that old trick again, did you?" Anne grabbed her mother's arm and jumped up and down, squealing, "But Mother, Joan said so. It's a big black spider." Mr. Russell turned over and yawned. He said, "Oh, stop jumping and squealing and listen. If there's a big black spider in bed, it's highly unlikely. Then why is Joan lying in there, staring at the ceiling and waiting to be bitten and to be spanked?" he added in a loud voice. Anne stopped squealing and listened gravely to her father, but when he finished speaking, she said, "But Joan said there was a spider, Daddy. She said there was." Anne stopped. Read that. Her daddy said, "Last one dressed gets the littlest melon," and he jumped out of the bed and chased Anne out of the room, roaring like a lion. Mr. Russell sang gaily in the shower, but Mrs. Russell frowned as she dressed. For from the children's room she could hear, "That's my sock, give it to me." "It's not, it's mine, give it back." The sound of a slap. So they're hitting each other. "Mother, Anne's slapping me. That's my petticoat. You're putting on my petticoat. Give it to me." "It's not, it's mine." And another sound of a slap. "That's mine. No, it's mine. Slap, bang, crash. Running steps. "Mother!" Mrs. Russell said to herself, quarreling from the minute they get up until they go to bed at night. "I do not believe that I can stand another day of it." Then she ran downstairs and began jamming oranges into the squeezer. Mr. Russell came whistling into breakfast. He said mildly, "Oh, scrambled eggs again. I was hoping for sausage and buckwheat cakes." Mrs. Russell said, "We had sausage and buckwheat cakes yesterday." Mr. Russell said, "Well, what about brook trout? Bill Smith has them nearly every morning." Mrs. Russell said crossly, "Perhaps that is why he looks like a trout, and his wife looks like a big halibut." Mr. Russell peered over at her at the top of the morning paper. He said, "You know, sweetheart, I think that the children fighting quarreling is making you irritated." Ooh, I moved you. Hang on. Let me fix it. There we go. Let me find where I was. Mrs. Russell said, "I think it is too. In fact, it is driving me crazy. Just listen to them." From the upper hall, they could hear, "It's my turn to go down first, Joan." "No, it's my turn." "You were first yesterday, you know you were. But last night you traded your first turn for my pink crown." "I did not." "You did too. Cheater, double cheater." In came the twins. Joan looked at her melon and then Anne's, and she said, "Anne's melon's bigger. She always gets the bigger of most everything." Anne said, "You had the biggest yesterday. You're just a pig. You always want the most." Their daddy said, "As a matter of fact, ladies, I have the biggest melon because I was the first one dressed. Now, hush." He glared at them. The twins sat meekly down to their breakfast. They had taken but 2 bites, however, when Anne poked Joan and hissed, "I've got the most cereal." Joan hissed back, "Yeah, but I got 3 pieces of bacon and you only got 2. Anne looked, and sure enough, Joan did have 3 pieces of bacon. She grabbed one, but Joan snatched her wrist and then scuffled, and they managed to tip over Anne's milk and spill it all over the front of their nice blue pleated skirts. Their daddy spanked them. And their mother sponged them off, and they left for school, red-eyed and miserable, but still quarreling. As they rounded the corner to their mother could hear, "That big tablet is mine. It's mine." After Mr. Russell had left for the office, Miss Russell picked up the telephone and called her friend Mrs. Quicktrick. She said, "Mrs. Quicktrick, this is Mrs. Russell, the twins' mother, and I want to know if Jasper and Myrtle ever quarrel." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Quicktrick, "all children quarrel. Why, yesterday Myrtle hit Jasper with her big doll and made the eyes come out, and then Jasper hit Myrtle with a little hammer out of his nice new toolbox, and the head came off the hammer, and I just told them that I wouldn't have them breaking their toys that way." Mrs. Russell said, "But the children weren't hurt." Mrs. Quicktrick said, "Why, I didn't notice. I was so angry at them for breaking their lovely tools, and the doll hospital won't be able to put Myrtle's doll eyes back together for 2 weeks, and you know how hard it is to get hammers these days." Mrs. Russell said, "Well, thank you anyway, Mrs. Quicktrick," and hung up the phone. She poured herself another cup of coffee, and while she drank it, she thought and thought about the little fighter quarrelers. Then she had an idea. She would call Miss Piggle-Wiggle and ask her what to do. Miss Piggle-Wiggle would know if anyone would. She called Miss Piggle-Wiggle and said, "Miss Piggle-Wiggle, I'm Miss Russell, the mother of Anne and Joan." Miss Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, yes, the twins, such darling little girls, and so pretty." Mrs. Russell said, "But they quarrel so, Miss Piggle-Wiggle. They begin fighting the moment they open their eyes in the morning, and they don't stop until they fall asleep from exhaustion." "It is dreadful, Miss Piggle-Wiggle. You should hear them." Miss Piggle-Wiggle said, "Oh, I know. That's my sock. No, it's mine. That's my box. No, it's mine. It's not. It's two. You have the most. You're a pig." Miss Russell said, "Why, Miss Piggle-Wiggle, you must have heard them. I was hoping they didn't quarrel when they were at your house." Miss Piggle-Wiggle said, "No, I haven't heard Anne and Joan, but I have heard hundreds of other children. You see, fighter quarrelus is a common children's disease, and it is very contagious, but easy to cure." "Easy to cure? Oh, Miss Piggle-Wiggle, how?" asked Mrs. Russell. "Well," said Miss Piggle-Wiggle, "in the first place, fighting and quarreling are merely habits. One morning a child wakens and feels cross, and so instead of smiling at his little brother and says good morning, he glares at his little brother and shouts, 'You've got on my shirt!' The little brother says, 'I do not!' because he don't. And the cross child says, 'You do too, you do too!' And the quarreling has begun. The next morning, both children have the fighter quarrelus, and they wake and begin shouting rudely at each other, and it soon becomes a habit that they forget how to be courteous. Now, Mrs. Russell, I believe that if fighter quarrelers could hear themselves as others hear them and see themselves as others see them, they would realize how unpleasant they were and would be cured. In order to do this with Anne and Joan, you and Mr. Russell will have to pretend to be Anne and Joan. First, however, you must write down every single fighting thing that the children say. Begin with this morning and keep a careful record of the whole day. Say nothing to the twins, but tomorrow you and Mr. Russell repeat their quarrels. I do not believe that it will be necessary to slap and pinch, but be sure to be loud and noisy. Don't laugh, and don't let the children know that it's just a game. Look quarrelsome, as well as acting quarrelsome. One day is usually sufficient. So Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle told their mom that they need to fight like the girls and show them what they look like, what they sound like. Mrs. Russell said, "Every morning Joan tells Anne that there is a big black spider on the bed, and Anne sighed, and Anne comes screaming into our room. Should Mr. Russell and I do that?" My, said Miss Piggle-Wiggle. "That is the way Billy and Tommy Peters used to start the day, only Billy told Tommy it was a cobra." "Well, cobra or black spider, you and Mr. Russell do the same. Goodbye, and good luck." After saying goodbye to Miss Piggle-Wiggle, Miss Russell sat down and wrote every word of Anne and Joan's morning quarreling that she could remember. After school, she purposely gave one of them a bigger apple, and then the other she followed them around and wrote down the quarreling. She stayed in her room while they undressed for bed and took notes, and fortunately the children were very productive and fought about the amount of toothpaste on their toothbrushes, whose turn it was for the shower, whose pillow was the softest, the amount of room that they had in the bed, who had the most covers, whose turn it was to turn off the light, and who had the biggest feet, who had the mouth open widest, and who had the most teeth, and everything. My, they were naughty and disagreeable. When she had finished writing it all down, Miss Russell handed a copy to Mr. Russell and told him about Miss Piggle-Wiggle. He thought it was a wonderful idea and studied his part carefully. The next morning, Joan opened her blue eyes and was reaching out to pinch Anne when she heard commotion in her mother and Daddy's room, and suddenly the door flew open and in came Mrs. Russell, clutching her bathrobe and squealing, "Anne, Joan, quick, there's a big black spider in our bed and it's on my side." Joan said calmly, "How do you know there's one? Did you see it?" Anne woke out of the habit. She leapt out of bed and ran for the door squealing. Her mother squealed louder. Then Anne, surprised, asked her what the trouble was. Her mother began pounding on the bed, yelling, "There's a big black spider in our bed on my side. Daddy said so. He saw it." Anne said, "But Mother, if there's a spider, why is Daddy in there?" Her mother paid no attention to her, but continued to squeal, "Daddy said there was. I'm scared." Joan said, "We better go in and look, Anne." So they solemnly marched into their mother's and Daddy's room. Mr. Russell was lying in bed gazing at the ceiling. Anne threw back the covers and Joan peered at the bed, but all they could see was Daddy's feet and toes wiggling. Anne said sternly, "Why did you scare Mother that way, Daddy?" Mr. Russell said, "Was she scared?" and jumped out of bed and ran into the bathroom, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Ha ha ha! My turn first for the shower!" At that, Mrs. Russell came flying from the twins' room and began pounding on the bathroom door, yelling, "It's not your turn first, it's mine! You traded me your first turn yesterday for a new golf ball, remember?" Mr. Russell laughed rudely and called out, "Too bad for you, I've got the door locked." Mrs. Russell kicked at the door and shouted, "Cheater, cheater, cheater!" Anne and Joan looked at each other. Look here. Here's a picture of the parents. The dad lying to the mom, telling her there's a spider in the bed, and the girls looking at them like, what are they doing? Their eyes were round with amazement. Anne whispered, "Let's get dressed." And Joan said, "Yes, let's hurry." And they tiptoed out of the room, closing the door carefully behind them. While they dressed, they could hear their mother and father quarreling. And when Mr. Russell came out of the shower, Miss Russell said, "You use my towel. That's my towel." Mr. Russell said, "Nuh-uh, it's mine." Mrs. Russell, "That's mine." Mr. Russell said, "That's my shirt. You got on my new t-shirt." Mrs. Russell said, "Well, you wore my golf sweater." Mr. Russell said, "Take off my new t-shirt." Mrs. Russell began to bawl. She sobbed, "You wore my new golf sweater and you promised me that I could wear the shirt. You're a pig." Mr. Russell said, "All right, baby, wear the old t-shirt." At breakfast, Mr. Russell took out a little ruler of his pocket and measured the grapefruit, and then he took the biggest. So he measured the grapefruits and took the biggest piece. Mother snatched it away from him and spilled the coffee on his new t-shirt. Mother served the scrambled eggs and gave herself a large heaping plate and Daddy a small serving. Daddy looked at both plates and said, "Pig." "Speaking of pig," said Miss Russell, "it's my turn for the car." Said Mr. Russell. "It's my turn. You had the car last week." Mrs. Russell said, "I only drove to the drugstore, and last week you went clear to the golf club." Mr. Russell said in a very disagreeable way, "It makes no difference to me how far you drove. You've had your turn, madam." Mrs. Russell began to bawl, "I think you're mean," she wailed. "Isn't it my turn, girls?" She turned to the twins. The girls looked at their mother, but they didn't answer. Instead, they asked to be excused, put on their coats, and hurried off to school. At dinner that night, Daddy took the chops to the bathroom. Daddy took the chops up to the bathroom and weighed them on the scale, and then he took the two biggest. Mother took the biggest baked potato, but she snorted at the string beans. She sorted the string beans out one by one so everyone got an equal share. They were ice cold. The twins cleared the table and Anne carried in the pumpkin pie. Now, pumpkin pie was the twins' very favorite dessert, and so Anne was very careful to walk slowly and put the pie down gently in front of Daddy. But it was wasted effort, for Mother reached over and grabbed the pie, saying, "I'll serve that." "Oh, no, you won't," said Daddy, jerking the pie back. "I will too," said Mother, reaching for the pie, but Daddy jerked it off the table and held it over his head. Mother grabbed his wrist, and the pie went splat all over the rug. The twins began to cry, and they said, "Mommy, Daddy, please stop quarreling. We can't stand it anymore. It's dreadful." Mother said, "Why, we thought you enjoyed fighting." Joan said, "We hate quarreling. We're so unhappy." Anne said, "Fighting is terrible. It makes us miserable." Mrs. Russell took Joan on her lap, and Mr. Russell took Anne on his, and they said, "To tell you the truth, girls, we don't like fighting either. It's just a habit we caught from you. Why, we must have been quarreling all day." The twins said, You have been." Daddy said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll all join hands and solemnly pledge that there shall be no more quarreling in the house. Then we'll all walk up to the Finley's drugstore and seal the pledge with ice cream. Does everyone agree?" "We all agree," they shouted. So they joined hands and said, "I do solemnly pledge that I will not quarrel or fight in this house ever again." Then they walked up to Mr. Finley's drugstore and had ice cream sodas, even though Anne saw Mr. Findley put 3 scoops of ice cream in Joan's soda and only 2 in hers. And even though Joan saw Mr. Findley put 2 scoops of strawberries in Anne's soda and only 1 in hers, neither of them said a word. The fighter quarrelist was cured. The end. So now that they saw their parents fighting like them, they decided it didn't make them very happy to watch all that and have to see it and hear it. So they decided they aren't going to do it either. And that ends Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the book, and I will come back next week with some new stories. I'll see you later. Bye.